Chapter 24. The Reckoning. With Jimmy gone, Gary Ketchum considered himself Wesley's top man. He was stood out the front of the ranch house with O'Connor, Tinker, Morgan, and that idiot Pat McGurn, listening to them babble on about women when they were supposed to be watching for Dalton. Wesley had assured them all that the bouncer would be coming. Ketchum looked over at the group again, shaking his head. Pat was holding a pump-action shotgun by the barrel and had it draped over his shoulder and down his back, scratching an itch with the pistol grip. Jesus, Wesley is lucky to have me, Ketchum thought. When he looked back towards the dirt road leading down to the ranch house, he saw a silver Mercedes coming on at speed. "There he is," he told the others, pumping his own shotgun and stepping forward. The rest lined up beside him. The Mercedes didn't stop at the turn in the road, instead crashing through the wooden fence and coming towards them in a straight line, fast. The 5 men opened up on the car with their guns, a mixture of pistols and shotguns, and Ketchum watched as the lights and mirrors blew to pieces. The front windshield cracked and chipped under the hail of rounds next, no doubt peppering whoever was inside, but still, the car kept coming. "Get out of here!" that fat coward Tinker yelled to Ketchum's left as the car got closer, heading for a raised garden wall just in front of them. Ketchum wasn't going anywhere. He racked another round into the shotgun and fired it off, pumped and readied another. When the Mercedes hit the little wall, it did so at an angle. That, and the speed of it, caused the car to fly up into the air and start to tilt away, showing Ketchum the bottom of the vehicle. He took aim and blasted 2 shots off at the gas tank. He was rewarded with a fiery explosion from inside the Mercedes, its trunk flying open as it fell back to the ground with an agonized screech of metal. It rolled on to a stop just outside the ranch house, 20 feet of grass behind it, now a trail of flames. Ketchum led the men over to the wreckage. Pat pulled open the driver's door, black smoke rolling out, as Ketchum pushed the barrel of his shotgun inside, aiming to finish Dalton off, if necessary. He doubted it would be, after all of that. The car was empty. Looking down at the pedals, he saw something familiar. His dagger, with the silver quarter in the hilt, had been driven down through the gas pedal and into the footwell. He pulled the dagger out and stared at the blood-stained blade, knowing that Dalton had tricked them. "Find that prick," he ordered the others, sliding the dagger into the empty sheath on his belt. Once Dalton had set the Mercedes up and let it go as a distraction, he ran for the ranch house at a dead sprint through the nearby woodland, out of sight from anybody on the road or at the front of the house. The last of the gunshots had finished ringing out by the time he got there, and he ducked inside through the nearest door on the ground floor. It was open, of course. Brad Wesley didn't fear any man, or so he liked to say, and he had his boys here too, the ones posted out the front with the guns. They were his protection. They kept him safe. Dalton decided it was time to let Wesley know he wasn't safe at all, not from the reckoning that was coming his way today. Dalton figured from the sound of the earlier gunfire that all of Wesley's men had been stationed together, waiting for him at the main entrance. He also figured that there were at least 4 or 5 of them from the racket they made. He hoped they would split up once they realized that he wasn't in the car and that they'd have to go look for him. So he moved quietly into the halls of the big house. Wesley was the only target on Dalton's mind, but if anybody else got in the way, they were going down too. O'Connor was the first to come across his path. The tall man had a revolver in his hand. He held it out in front of himself in a crooked elbow stance like some 50s cop. He cautiously stepped into the kitchen, the gun leading the way, to where Dalton was waiting. Dalton ducked down smoothly behind a counter as Wesley's man passed him, just 3 feet away over a white marble countertop. Crouched down, Dalton waited until O'Connor reached the end of the counter. He bided his time as he watched the black barrel, then the receiver, of the revolver float past his eyeline. Once O'Connor's hand and forearm passed too, Dalton stood up and snatched the revolver from the other man's grip in one fluid backhand motion. There was a look of shock on O'Connor's face, and Dalton turned it into a look of pain by thrusting an elbow into his throat. O'Connor staggered back, hands holding his neck, eyes bulging and making choked coughing sounds. Dalton looked down at the gun in his hand. He had it held by the receiver, just as he'd grabbed it, the steel-rimmed pistol grip sticking up like a blackjack. For a moment, he thought of turning it around and using it as the manufacturer intended. But when he looked back at O'Connor's quickly purpling face, he knew the other man was out of the fight. To make sure, he cracked him twice in quick succession with the heavy butt of the revolver. O'Connor slumped down a wall, eyes closed and blood dripping onto his shirt. Probably not dead, but certainly not getting up any time soon. Sounds of movement in the next room drew Dalton's attention, and he moved out of the kitchen. He found himself in the games room that he'd walked through on his first visit here. Stood in the far doorway, staring out at the cars beyond and with his back to Dalton, was Morgan, a shiny silver revolver held down by his left side. Without breaking his stride, but walking with a purposeful heel-to-toe footfall, Dalton silently approached the big man. Along the way, he passed a pool table. It looked like it had been abandoned mid-game. He carefully lifted the nearest cue and spun it in his grip as he went, ending up with the heavy end pointing to the sky. Dalton held the cue like a club in a two-handed grip and stopped when he was a few feet away from his target, ready to strike. For whatever reason, Morgan turned, his mouth starting to open as if he was going to shout something back into the house. His eyes opened wider when he saw Dalton standing there on top of him. Dalton didn't wait for Morgan to regain his senses or to raise the revolver. Wielding the cue like a samurai uses a sword, he swung down from on high with a diagonal slice that landed with a meaty thud into Morgan's neck. Then he used the bounce back to reverse the strike, looking to land the same blow on the other side, hoping to hit the carotid artery. This time, though, Morgan flinched, and the heavy piece of wood smacked across his jaw instead, with an audible crack. Dalton waited a moment for the big man to drop, but instead he just stood there, his eyes half rolled back in his head, and the other half of them looking at Dalton as if asking for advice on what to do next. Dalton knew what to do next. He raised the cue high again and brought it down in a final strike to the centre of Morgan's head. And with that, Morgan's legs finally gave way and he tumbled out through the doorway, his gun dropping to the brick-lined floor from his limp fingers. Another concussion, but another of Wesley's men that might make it through today alive. Unlike Wesley. Dalton threw the cue down on the table as he headed back inside. He was looking for the stairs to the second floor, thinking that was where Wesley would be hiding, or waiting. When he got to the largest room on the ground floor, Dalton saw the entrance to the glass-lined sunroom. He looked in, half expecting to see Wesley still sat there, still eating his breakfast, still trying to make a deal. But the room was empty. There would be no deals today. A noise from the kitchen caused Dalton to spin. "O'Connor!" someone was saying. It was a whispered call that sounded like a shout in the silent house. "Shit!" came the next statement, and Dalton knew that someone had found the slumped body of O'Connor. Knew, too, that they'd be coming this way next. He placed himself in a shadow by a big cabinet near the door to the room he was in, and waited. It wasn't long until the door swung cautiously open. This time, it was a shotgun that led the way, but the man holding it was doing so securely, both hands on the weapon. Dalton knew he had no chance of snatching the gun away like he had from O'Connor, so he waited a little longer. The man who carried the gun was Ketchum. Dalton had learned his name after he'd driven through Strudenmeyer's Ford dealership in his monster truck at Wesley's behest. He'd learned that day too that this was the same man who'd come at him in the Double Deuce one night with a blade in his boot. A dirty fighter, but for all of that, ultimately, just another roadblock in his way today. Another no-account soldier of Wesley's. Dalton let Ketchum move into the room. He slipped in behind him, stalked him, and watched as he checked the corners that he passed. When Ketchum reached the far side of the room, he quickly peered past the last wall into a small plant-lined corner, clearly expecting to find Dalton there, but finding it empty instead. A floorboard creaked under Dalton's foot. He knew that Ketchum had heard it from the way the other man tensed and paused. Just a microsecond, but long enough to show that he was thinking about what to do next. What he chose to do was spin as quickly as he could and raise the shotgun to shoot. Just as Dalton expected. Dalton met the move with a kick to the scattergun's barrel, deflecting it as Ketchum pulled the trigger. It went off and destroyed a lamp on a nearby table, pieces of china and glass scattering wildly. Through the loud ringing in his ears, Dalton realized that the sound of the gunshot would bring others to this room, and knew that he had to end this quickly. A shotgun is a powerful tool, with the pump-action variety in particular known for their reliability. But their functioning also requires you to be able to pump the grip to get the next round ready. Ketchum seemed to decide that he didn't have time for that, so instead he swung the butt of the gun for Dalton's head. Dalton ducked it quickly and caught the weapon in both hands on the return swing. For a moment, both men struggled for control, the heavy weapon in dispute. But then Dalton kneed his opponent's exposed gut and used the other man's surprised reaction to twist the weapon sharply as he turned. Ketchum went down to the hardwood floor, and the shotgun went skittering across it and out of their reach. Ketchum didn't stay down long. He reached to his belt and came up swinging with a dagger in his hand. Dalton had to leap back to avoid the cut. He took his stance and waited for the other man to stand, figuring he'd rather fight him like that, where he was more predictable, than trying to get to him on the ground through his wild slashes. When Ketchum got to his feet, he took up a knife fighter's stance and quickly spun the thick dagger into a blade down grip. It was then, as he took the measure of his opponent, that Dalton saw the base of the dagger's hilt. The shining silver eagle staring out at him. And he knew. Ketchum tried to trick Dalton, leading with a lunging low kick before swinging the blade high at his head. Dalton blocked the kick easily, then ducked under the swing. He leaned away from the backhand that came next, the sharp point passing inches from his face, before sidestepping the inevitable thrust. Dalton timed his kick perfectly, just as Ketchum's lunge reached its end, and thrust his boot up into the knifeman's wrist, breaking his grip. Both men watched the knife fly up into the air, Ketchum's head shooting up and following the spinning motion, calculating how to grab the weapon when it came back down. Dalton wasn't waiting for that. His left hand shot out and closed tightly around Ketchum's throat in a vice grip. The other man forgot about catching anything then, both of his hands going instinctively to grab at Dalton's arm. Dalton didn't forget the catch. He snatched the returning dagger from the air and then stabbed it straight into Ketchum's belly. "Tails again," he growled, staring the other man straight in his shocked face, driving the blade upward with a ripping motion as he delivered vengeance for Garrett. The signature click-clack sound of a shotgun being pumped drew Dalton's attention upwards to the small balcony overlooking the room. Pat McGurn was stood there and was aiming right at him. Dalton quickly spun the body of Ketchum between him and Pat, ducking down and using the dying man as a human shield. He heard the scatterguns blast and felt the impact of the buckshot as it pounded into Ketchum's back. Luckily, nothing got through. Dalton knew he couldn't wait for the second blast. Letting the dead man in his grip drop, he pulled out the dagger and launched it up at the gunman as he was racking in the next round. "Ugh!" was all the former bartender could weakly manage as the dagger flew in under his ribcage and into his heart. Pat pulled the trigger again, this time involuntarily, his last shot flying wide. Then he tumbled off the balcony, twisting through the air to land beside Ketchum with a hard thud. Dalton quickly found the stairs up to the balcony where Pat McGurn had been a moment before. On the second floor he found Wesley's bedroom, a garish oversized four-poster bed in its centre. A door at the far end of the room led out to a balcony. There was a rocking chair swaying in the breeze, a little glass table beside it with a crystal decanter next to a half-filled glass, and a matching ashtray nearby. Dalton could smell the cigar smoke, but both the bedroom and the balcony were empty. Wesley wasn't here. The next stairs Dalton came to brought him down to a large, darkened room. When his eyes adjusted to the low light, he saw that the room was filled with big game trophies. Under walls coated with the heads of deer, warthogs, and even a walrus, there stood the taxidermied remains of all kinds of beasts, both large and small, posed as they would have been in real life. Dalton moved silently past jackals, bears, and boars, then paused as he heard a door opening ahead of him. He hoped it was finally Wesley. He knew it wasn't when he heard Tinker's voice whispering, "I hate this place." Dalton moved back into the shadows and watched the fat bear of a man stumble around slowly in the darkness of the room. He was carrying a Beretta semi-auto, holding it up in one hand like a man who'd never held a gun before in his life. As Tinker passed by a row of ivory trunks into the centre of the room, Dalton slipped behind a full-sized polar bear rearing up on its hind legs. He looked down to see that the big exhibit was on a trolley with wheels and silently pushed loose the brake pedal with his foot. Tinker mumbled in fear as the huge creature came at him out of the darkness, whimpering for a moment before finally raising up his pistol and opening fire on the animal's dead body and fierce-looking face. He managed to get off 4 rounds before the trolley wheels hit a small step and the whole thing toppled forward. The entire 9-foot-tall, 1,000-pound stuffed animal landed on top of him. "You're made for each other," Dalton said, looking at the big man pinned down tight under the bear.